It was a dreary night in late October when Ellie decided to take a long drive down Route 89, a route infamous for its sparse population and haunting tales. The relentless rain had drenched the day, leaving a thick mist to hover above the ground, as if the earth itself was breathing in heavy, languid sighs. Ellie's old sedan coughed down the highway, its headlights barely cutting through the fog. Ellie was returning from her grandmother's funeral, her mood as somber as the sky above. The only sound that accompanied her was the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers and the occasional crackle from the radio. She felt a pang of loneliness, wishing she hadn't decided to drive through the night. As she rounded a sharp bend, the radio sputtered, shifting from static to a clear, chilling voice, "Don't look back." Before descending back into static, Ellie's heart raced. She chided herself for being silly. It was just a coincidence, a product of a tired mind. Yet, as the miles stretched on, the feeling of being watched crept over her. At the stroke of midnight, Ellie's headlights caught sight of a figure at the side of the road. A woman, soaked to the bone, thumbed for a lift. Against her better judgment, Ellie pulled over. The woman slid into the passenger seat without a word, her face obscured by a tangle of wet hair. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse. "I thought I'd be stuck out there all night." Ellie nodded, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her. "Bad night to be out," she said, attempting lightness. "Where can I drop you?" "Just ahead," the woman replied, pointing down the road. The car's interior chilled, and Ellie turned up the heat, but it made no difference. She felt a deep cold seeping into her bones. The woman remained silent, her presence filling the car with a heavy, oppressive air. Suddenly, the woman turned her head, and Ellie caught a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were hollow, endless pits of darkness, and her skin pale as death. Ellie's breath hitched, and she focused on the road, heart pounding. The car radio flickered to life again, the same eerie voice breaking through, "Closer now, closer." Ellie's hands trembled on the wheel. The road seemed to stretch infinitely before her, each mile more isolating than the last. "Stop the car," the woman said abruptly. Ellie obeyed, her instincts screaming at her to get away. They were on a bridge, the river below them obscured by the mist. The woman opened the door and stepped out, vanishing into the fog as if she had never been there at all. Ellie drove away as fast as she could, not daring to look back. The radio crackled once more, never alone. Before Ellie, in a panic, turned it off completely. Her heart did not calm until the first signs of dawn crept across the horizon and the fog began to lift. Exhausted but relieved to be away from the eerie stretch of road, Ellie stopped at a diner. Over a cup of coffee, she told the waitress about her night. The waitress's face grew pale. "You've seen her then. The ghost of Mary Beth. They say she died on that bridge, waiting for her lover to return. She flags down lone drivers, looking for someone to take her place." Ellie shuddered, eager to leave the story behind her. But as she continued her drive, the feeling of being watched never quite left her. Shadows seemed to move just at the edge of her vision, and every stretch of road looked ominously familiar, as if looping her back to the bridge. Days turned into weeks, and Ellie tried to convince herself it was just a figment of her imagination, a trick of stress and sorrow. But the universe had a different plan. Driving home from work one evening, her radio flickered on of its own accord, static filling the car before that same eerie voice whispered, "Return." And as Ellie's eyes widened in horror, the road ahead seemed to change, the familiar turns leading her back, always back to that mist-covered bridge where the story had begun, and where it was far from over. Ellie's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white as the radio's static morphed into that whisper once more. "Return." The word echoed in her ears, reverberating through the car like a sinister mantra. Her heart raced, and she glanced in her rearview mirror half expecting to see the ghostly woman from that night sitting in her back seat. But there was only emptiness. The haunting was in the air around her, in the chilling whispers of the radio, in the familiar dread that clawed at her spine. As the road twisted and turned, it seemed to Ellie as though the world outside was warping, the trees bending unnaturally towards her car as if pushed by an unseen force. The mist began to roll in again, thicker this time, cloaking the world in a blanket of white that swallowed up the distance and made the night impenetrable. The car's headlights barely made a dent in the fog. Ellie's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She should turn around, go back to the city, to the light and the noise and the people. But something pulled her forward, an inexplicable force that guided her car deeper into the darkness. Then, out of the silence, the sound of a child's laughter rang through the car. It was light and joyous, a stark contrast to the oppressive dread that filled the space. Ellie's eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound that couldn't possibly be there. The laughter grew louder, surrounding her, filling the car until it was all she could hear. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence slammed down like a verdict. In the distance, illuminated by a sudden break in the fog, stood the bridge, the same bridge where she had seen the ghostly woman. Ellie's pulse pounded in her ears. She should drive away, escape this nightmare. But her car seemed to move of its own volition, inching closer to the bridge as if drawn by a magnet. She stepped out of the car, the ground wet beneath her feet, the river below rushing violently as if in torment. The mist clung to her skin, damp and cold. "Mary Beth," she called into the fog, her voice small and trembling. No answer came, but the temperature dropped, a cold so deep it seeped into her bones. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, her breath visible in the air. Then, across the bridge, a shadow moved, quick and darting out of sight before she could get a good look. "Who's there?" Ellie's voice was firmer this time, her fear turning to frustration. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being haunted by this place and its specters. The laughter returned, closer now, almost directly in her ear. Ellie spun around, her heart in her throat, but again, there was nothing. Just the dense, oppressive fog and the sound of the rushing river. Without warning, the air shifted, the mist swirling violently around her as if caught in a sudden storm. Shapes formed in the fog, human shapes that moved with purpose towards her. Ellie stumbled back, her back hitting the cold metal railing of the bridge. Figures formed from the mist, their features blurred but unmistakably human, their eyes hollow and their mouths agape in silent screams. Ellie's scream tore through the night, raw and desperate. She turned and ran back towards her car, the figures in pursuit. Their feet made no sound on the damp pavement, their forms shifting with the fog as they moved. Ellie fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip them. As she threw herself into the car, slamming the door shut behind her, the figures converged on the vehicle. Their hands, pale and translucent, pressed against the windows, their faces distorted with sorrow and rage. Ellie screamed again, turning the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, and she slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as she sped away from the bridge. Behind her, the figures faded into the mist, but their silent screams echoed in her ears, a chilling reminder that she was not free of this curse. The road stretched before her, endless and winding, leading her deeper into a night that had no end. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, laughter whispered through the cracks in the world, and Ellie drove on, pursued by horrors unseen but deeply felt, her story spiraling into darkness with no end in sight. Pressing down upon her, Ellie felt a newfound terror taking root. The apparition had left more than just a visual imprint, it had stirred something within the depths of her soul, something ancient and terrifying that she couldn't quite understand nor escape. The silence that now engulfed her seemed alive, charged with a foreboding whisper that crept along the fringes of her consciousness. Compelled by a force she could neither deny nor comprehend, Ellie stepped out of the car. Her feet crunched softly on the frost-covered ground as she moved towards the center of the clearing where the apparition had stood. The air was icy, each breath a sharp sting in her lungs, and yet she felt a burning need to stand where the ghostly figure had, to connect with whatever remnants of energy might linger there. As she reached the spot, a sudden chill swept through her, more profound and bone-chilling than the night air. It was as if the very ground beneath her feet pulsed with a cold fire, an otherworldly energy that seeped through her shoes and gripped her legs. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees whispering secrets in a language lost to time, their voices low and mournful. Ellie spun around, her heart pounding, as the sensation of being watched grew overwhelming. She scanned the tree line, her eyes straining to see through the darkness that the thin moonlight did little to penetrate. That's when she saw them, figures in the shadows, dozens of them, all standing motionless, their eyes glowing faintly like distant stars. They were specters, she realized, spirits bound to this haunted forest, each one trapped in an eternal vigil. The radio in her car crackled to life once more, the sad melody resuming, now accompanied by a soft, sobbing cry that intertwined with the tune. It was a sound of pure sorrow, echoing through the clearing, filling the space with an aura of despair. Ellie's skin prickled with goosebumps, and her breath formed a visible cloud in the air as the temperature dropped further, the cold slicing through her clothes. She wanted to run, to escape the clearing and drive away from this nightmare, but her feet were rooted to the spot, as if the earth itself held her in place. The figures began to move, drifting towards her with a slow, deliberate grace. Their faces were blurred, their features shifting and changing like smoke in the wind, but their eyes remained fixed on her, bright and unblinking. Ellie's mind raced, panic setting in as the figures encircled her. She could feel their sadness, a collective mourning that was palpable in the air, a grief so intense it was nearly suffocating. The figures reached out to her, their hands almost touching her, their fingers inches from her skin. And then they spoke, their voices a chorus of whispers that filled the clearing. "Help us," they said, their tone both a plea and a demand. "Free us." Ellie's heart thudded in her chest. How she managed to croak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Find the heart," they replied in unison, their voices echoing like a wind through dead leaves. "Return it to the earth." Before Ellie could ask what they meant, the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist until all that was left were their glowing eyes, which blinked once, twice, and then were gone, leaving Ellie alone once again in the chilling silence of the clearing. Shaken to her core, Ellie stumbled back to her car. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, the cold seeping into her bones. She didn't understand what had just happened or what was expected of her. What heart were they speaking of? And where would she even begin to look for such a thing? As she sat there, trying to gather her thoughts, the radio shifted again, the music fading out to be replaced by a voice, low and clear and infinitely sad. "The heart is lost in time, bound by blood and shadow. Seek the old church, follow the trail of the fallen stars." The voice faded, leaving Ellie in a stunned silence. An old church. Fallen stars. The clues were cryptic, the path unclear. But the desperation in the voices of the spirits was something she could not ignore. They had chosen her, for reasons she could not fathom, and now she was part of their story, a story of sorrow and shadows. With a deep breath, Ellie started the car, her resolve hardening. The night was still dark, the road ahead uncertain, but she would follow it wherever it led. The mystery of the heart and the haunted whispers of the forest had woven their way into her life, entangling her in a web of spectral intrigues that promised only more darkness to come. The journey was far from over, and the shadows that flickered at the edge of her vision were but a harbinger of the deeper darkness that awaited her. Ellie drove through the night, her destination unclear, but her mission now hauntingly defined by the ethereal voices. The road wound through thick forests where the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the mist that wrapped around them. The moon, a thin crescent in the sky, provided little light, casting ghostly shadows across the road that seemed to twitch and stir as if alive. Every curve of the road brought new terrors. Shadows darted in the periphery of her vision, shapes that were too quick to be natural, too sinister to be merely tricks of the light. The air grew colder with each passing mile, a creeping frost that seemed to seep into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably despite the car's struggling heater. The radio had fallen silent once more, leaving only the sound of the car's engine and the occasional gust of wind that howled past the windows like the cries of the lost. Ellie's mind replayed the words of the spectral figures, turning them over, looking for meaning in the cryptic instructions. The heart is lost in time, bound by blood and shadow. Seek the old church, follow the trail of the fallen stars. The phrases echoed in her head, a puzzle whose pieces were as elusive as the figures themselves. As dawn began to break, the darkness of the night retreated, replaced by a grey, somber sky that promised rain. Ellie's eyes were drawn to the horizon, where the first faint light filtered through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the landscape. It was then that she saw it, silhouetted against the morning light, an old church, its spire jagged against the sky, its stone walls worn and covered in ivy. With a mixture of relief and apprehension, Ellie turned off the main road, following a narrow path that led towards the church. The building looked abandoned, the graveyard that surrounded it overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, the tombstones tilting precariously. She parked the car and stepped out, the air damp and heavy with the scent of moss and decay. The church door was ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Ellie approached, her steps slow and cautious. The inside of the church was dark, the only light coming from broken windows that allowed the morning light to filter in, casting strange patterns on the dusty floor. The pews were coated in a thick layer of dust, and the altar was bare, stripped of any ornamentation. Ellie walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silent space. She reached the altar, running her fingers over the rough stone, feeling the cold seep into her skin. She glanced around, searching for any sign, any clue that might point her towards the heart the spirits had spoken of. That's when she noticed the floor beneath the altar. It was different from the rest of the church, made of wood rather than stone, and in the center, a large, circular symbol had been carved into the surface. Ellie knelt down, tracing the edges of the symbol with her fingers. It was then that she felt it, a slight give in the wood, as if part of it could be moved. Working quickly, she cleared away the dust and debris, revealing a small handle embedded in the wood. With a deep breath, she pulled on it, and the floorboard lifted, revealing a dark cavity below. Inside, nestled among old, rotting vestments, was a small, iron box, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Ellie's heart raced as she reached for the box, her hands trembling. She lifted it out of the cavity, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was then that she heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the very walls of the church. The sound was haunting, filled with such despair that Ellie nearly dropped the box. She turned, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the church, half expecting to see the figures from the forest standing there. But there was nothing, only the shifting shadows and the echoing cry that seemed to permeate the air. Clutching the box tightly, Ellie ran from the church, the wail following her, a sound that seemed to chase her back to her car. She threw the box into the passenger seat and drove away, leaving the church and its ghosts behind. But as she drove, the box began to hum, a soft, harmonic sound that filled the car. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, casting an eerie light that flickered like the heartbeat of something ancient and powerful. Ellie's mind raced with questions and fear, but one thought rose above the rest: she had found the heart. But what was it bound to? What shadows tied it to this world, and what blood had been spilled to keep it here? As she pondered these questions, the landscape around her began to change as Ellie sped away from the ominous church. The landscape around her began to warp subtly, the trees bending inward as if to form a tunnel, guiding her path. The skies darkened abruptly, heavy clouds rolling in like an omen. The box hummed continuously, its glow intensifying, casting long, twisted shadows across the car's interior. Ellie's heart hammered against her chest, a mix of dread and an urgent need to uncover the truth driving her forward. The road ahead seemed less familiar by the second, taking on a surreal quality. It curled through the dense forest, now thick with fog that swirled mysteriously around her moving car. The air grew colder, and a thin layer of frost began to form on the edges of her windshield. Ellie's breaths came out in visible puffs, and despite the heater blasting at full capacity, a chill seeped into her bones. As she drove, the hum from the box transitioned into a low chant, a sound so ancient and alien that it seemed to vibrate through her very soul. Words were indistinguishable, but the cadence was hypnotic, lulling yet deeply unsettling. Ellie fought against the urge to focus on it, aware that the sound might pull her into depths she wasn't ready to face. The road finally opened up to a clearing as the skies unleashed a torrential downpour, reducing visibility to near zero. Lightning streaked across the sky, each flash illuminating the scene in staccato bursts. A vast, open field lay before her, in the center of which stood a decrepit structure that looked like an old farmhouse, abandoned and succumbing to the ravages of time and nature. Ellie parked the car at the edge of the clearing and took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She grabbed the glowing box and stepped out into the rain. Each drop that hit her face felt like ice, stinging her skin, but she pressed on, her feet sinking into the muddy ground. Approaching the farmhouse, Ellie noticed that the structure seemed less touched by time at this closer distance. Instead, it possessed an aura of latent energy, as if it were waiting for her. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind, its creaks in tune with the low chant from the box. With a trembling hand, Ellie pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the box in her hands. As she walked through the hallway, her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, and the air grew denser, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. The chanting grew louder, and the box's glow intensified as Ellie made her way deeper into the house. She followed the sound, which seemed to be emanating from below. Finding a staircase leading down to what she presumed was the cellar, Ellie descended, each step creaking ominously under her weight. The cellar was vast, the air thick with shadows that moved as if alive. In the center of the room, there was a pit, and as Ellie approached, the box vibrated violently in her hands, its chant now a deafening roar. She stood at the edge of the pit, the glow from the box revealing its contents, a swirling vortex of shadows and light, spinning in a hypnotic dance. Ellie realized this was the heart of the haunting, the source of all the sorrow and pain she had encountered. The spirits had guided her here, to this place where the veil between worlds was thin, where she could finally set things right. With a resolve born of a mixture of fear and determination, Ellie lifted the box and prepared to end the cycle of suffering. As she did, the shadows in the room coalesced into the forms of the spectral figures from the forest, their eyes pleading. The climax of Ellie's harrowing journey approached, the final act in a night that had stretched her very understanding of reality. She was ready to close this chapter, to silence the haunting melody that had followed her, and to confront whatever lay beyond the swirling vortex of the pit. The shadows watched, the box pulsed, and the storm raged above as Ellie braced herself to make a choice that could either free the trapped souls or bind her to them forever. The conclusion of this eerie tale awaits, holding the promise of either salvation or damnation, as the boundaries between the living and the spectral blur into obscurity. Ellie stood at the brink of the abyss, the pulsating box in her hands resonating with the swirling vortex below. The spectral figures encircled her, their mournful eyes locked on the heart that throbbed with an eerie light. Thunder boomed overhead, shaking the decaying farmhouse as if it mirrored the turmoil within Ellie's own heart. She glanced down at the box, its carvings now ablaze with a ghostly fire. The voices of the spirits whispered frantically, their tones urgent. "Free us," they cried, a chorus of sorrow and desperation that filled the air. Ellie felt the weight of their centuries-old chains binding them to this earthly realm, and she knew what she had to do. With a deep, steadying breath, she knelt at the edge of the pit, the box held out before her. "I release you," she whispered, her voice firm yet filled with compassion. The box vibrated violently, a crescendo of energy building within as she slowly tipped it forward, releasing its contents into the vortex. The moment the heart touched the swirling shadows, a blinding light erupted, enveloping Ellie and the entire cellar. The spirits cried out, their voices lifting in a haunting melody that rose above the storm. One by one, their forms brightened into brilliant orbs of light, each orb shooting upwards, piercing the ceiling of the cellar, and vanishing into the night sky. The ground trembled beneath Ellie's feet, the house groaning as if in relief. As the light subsided, the cellar grew silent, the vortex dissipating into nothing more than a harmless whirl of dust. Ellie stood slowly, her legs shaky, the box now silent and dark in her hands. It was over. The binding had been undone, the spirits freed from their earthly tethers. She climbed the stairs back to the main level of the house, each step lighter than the last. Exiting the farmhouse, she was greeted by the calming aftermath of the storm. The rain had stopped, and in its place, a serene mist hovered over the land, glowing faintly in the light of a new dawn. The air was fresh, cleansed of the heavy sorrow that had once permeated it. Ellie walked back to her car, placing the now inert box on the passenger seat. She looked back at the farmhouse one last time, seeing it not as the sinister place it had been, but rather as a peaceful relic of the past, its dark history finally laid to rest. As she drove away, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden beams across the landscape. Ellie felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. She had faced unimaginable horrors, but she had also brought peace to tortured souls. The experience had changed her, had shown her depths of strength she hadn't known she possessed. But the world of the paranormal would never be far away. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, she caught a fleeting glimpse of a pale figure standing by the roadside, watching her leave. A chill ran down her spine, a reminder that the veil between worlds is thin and crossings, though rare, are always possible. Ellie drove on, the road ahead clear and the sky brightening into a brilliant blue. She knew that her life had been irrevocably altered by the events of the night. There would be other mysteries, other shadows to chase. But for now, she relished the quiet of the morning and the promise of a peaceful day. The haunted melodies of the night had faded, but their echoes would linger in her memory, a haunting refrain that would occasionally whisper to her in the stillness of quiet nights, reminding her of the night she freed the spirits at the old farmhouse, where the boundary between the living and the dead had blurred into a dance of light and shadow.